Greetings and welcome to another Cedric Nunn Photo Talks on my YouTube channel. And today I'm speaking on the 26th of December 2024, towards the end of this year. And the talk I'm going to give today is a chapter I wrote some time back, I think more than 2 years ago, for a journal entitled Culture and Liberation. And this journal hasn't yet come to fruition, as these academic journals sometimes have their own trajectory. They take that much longer to be in production. So this journal, as I understand it, will have many different contributions, and I was one of those. So I am putting this talk I went to great pains to produce, gave it a lot of thought and spent quite a bit of time writing it. As I understand it, an entire chapter in this book. And I'm now committing it into my archival vault, which is these talks, because this one is in particular about photography in South Africa. So I entitled the talk Represent Photography in South Africa During and After Apartheid. And here's the talk, the paper, actually, the chapter that I wrote for this, the essay that I wrote for this chapter. Growing up in the Zululand and Natal of the 1960s and 70s, was to emerge into a world that was in the heart of the apartheid era, one in which the tsunami of legislation that followed the repression of the Sharpeville massacre, the treason trials, the June 76 uprising, and the death of Steve Bantu Biko created an icy cold and sterile era in which we faced the bleakness of our then dismal present and future. As an adolescent in the late 1960s and a teenager in the early 70s, my developing consciousness grew into this grim reality. Dreams of a normal life eroded and slowly solidified into the urgent need to resist that dystopian present and build a vision for a brighter future, if not for oneself personally, then for the generations to come. Having been thrust into the coalface of South Africa's extraction economy, when at the age of 16, I abruptly found myself employed as a semi-skilled worker in a sugar factory on the Natal North Coast. I was rapidly pulled into the emerging workers' movement and unions which were taking shape in the early 1970s. As my political consciousness grew in this environment, I found myself searching for a medium with which to contribute to the social change that I increasingly understood to be of vital and urgent necessity. Not an easy task in the intellectually and culturally barren landscape of the denuded countryside of the time. So it was simply by fortuitous luck that I eventually stumbled across photography, and documentary photography in particular, as the chosen medium with which to engage. 8 years later, and soon after participating in a strike at the sugar factory in which I was employed in the early 80s, I quit the job and embarked on the road to becoming a documentary photographer, an obscure occupation at the time and one with no prospect of an income as a black South African in the apartheid age of job discrimination. It was undertaken purely through the sheer faith and zeal of youthfulness and an unshakable, if half-baked, belief in the necessity of the task at hand. Luck continued to accompany me when I met the people who would become mentors an unrecognized position at the time, apprentice being more accurate at description, and colleagues in the shared journey ahead. These significant figures, primarily photographers Peter Mackenzie, Omar Bacha, and later Paul Weinberg, helped shape my skills, ideas, and approach to the medium and my application of it to my world at the time. The early years. Arriving in Johannesburg in 1983, after almost a year's sojourn in Europe, where I had again had the good fortune to connect with South African dissidents and exiles of a very independent mind, who further shaped my mind to include an internationalist overview of the liberatory task at hand, was once again to be located at the coalface of social change, as the resistance to the apartheid state's tricameral parliament gathered strength, and the emergence of the United Democratic Front, the UDF, took shape. Of course, during my absence abroad, the seminal conference, Culture and Resistance, had taken place in Gaborone, Botswana, in 1982, and I had engaged in lengthy discussions on the outcomes of the deliberations with South African exiles who had attended, such as the poet and Stockholm-based artist Lefifi Tladi. Afrapix's Peter Mackenzie had delivered what is still today considered a seminal paper on the role of photography in the struggle for liberation and change. And that paper can be seen in South African History Online. It's archived there. You can find it there. At this point, Afrapix, the photographers' collective, which had not been more than an idea of Omar Bacha, Paul Weinberg, and Peter Mackenzie when I departed for Europe, had now taken form and was operating out of the South African Council of Churches, or the SACC, in Khotsa House, in Joburg Park, Central Johannesburg. On my return, I literally hit the deck running and was quickly absorbed into the urgency to document the rapidly growing anti-apartheid organization in the then Transvaal and the resistance that defined the Sharpeville Triangle uprisings and that of the tricameral parliament, amongst other acts of resistance. Afrapix, an idea whose time had clearly come, was well placed to respond to these rapid developments. The Afrapix of the time, consisting of members Paul Weinberg, Omar Bacha, Peter Mackenzie, Wendy Schwegman, and myself, was to rapidly attract new members. Some full members and other associates, such as Steve Hilton Barber, Chris Kwazi, Kentridge Mangawung Matabate, Guy Tillum, Dave Hartman, Jill De Vlieg, Anna Zeminski, John Liebenberg, Herbert Mabuza, Cecil Sauls, Vui Mbalo, Rafik Mayet, Jiva Rajkov-Pal, Myron Peters, Pagati Pax Magwaza, Desini Mudlia, Chris Lidokovsky, Paul Grendon, Roger Menkes, Ellen Elmendorf, Peter Afterheider, Santu Moffat King, Roger Bosch, Graham Goddard, amongst others. I was briefly coordinator during 1983 before we began to hire full-time staff to meet the growing demand for images. This demand came from the emerging alternative press as well as a growing number of grassroots publications and media that emerged from the organizations that took form in the communities, the labor movement and trade unions, youth, women, religious, civics, and the many other organizations engaged in confronting apartheid and working towards change. These publications included, for example, Agenda, Association for Rural Advancement, Congress of South African Trade Union News, Congress of South African Writers, Chemical Workers Industrial Union, Congress of South Africa, Curriculum Development Program, DITSELA, Food and Allied Workers Union, Federation of Transvaal Women, Grassroots, Garment and Allied Workers Union, the Grail, Masisubumeni, National Union of Students, National Union of Mine Workers, Natal Organization of Women, Okasi Development Trust, Progressive Arts Project, Rural Finance Facility, Rorke's Drift Arts and Crafts Center, Sheer Sounds, State of the Nation, South African Labour Bulletin, South African Council of Churches, South African Domestic Workers Union, Transvaal Indian Congress, Transport and General Workers Union, Transvaal Rural Action Committee, Umanyano Publications, Upfront, Wits Press, Women's Health Project, Workers' World, Wits Student, Young Christian Students, Zanendaba Storytellers Group, Freya Weekblad, Weekly Mail, New Nation, South, The New African, and Africa, amongst many others. Demand also came from many established publications worldwide. Afrapix also began to supply monthly packages in the pre-digital era. These were literally packets of physical hard copy photographs that were edited selections from the month's production of the work of all available photographers, from which copies were generated and sent via the Johannesburg Central Post Office to various branches of the anti-apartheid movement abroad. The African National Congress, or the ANC, also received such a package, gratis, monthly, via the London-based International Defence and Aid Fund, which was a media front for the banned organization. Afrapix held weekly meetings to touch base and inform each other of what we intended working on during the week ahead, alert each other as to developments on the political front, important meetings and events that needed covering, essentially editorial meetings in which we self-organized ourselves to ensure as wide a coverage as possible, as well as initiating group projects and driving existing projects to their conclusion. All members of Afrapix were essentially self-employed freelancers, if you like, affiliated to an organization that we all contributed to financially, with 30% of all individual personal revenue generated returning to the collective Afrapix kitty for operational expenses, such as staff salaries, maintaining a darkroom, rent, etc. We also held annual general meetings in which members from the regions attended. It was really only in our annual general meetings that broader issues were engaged with, such as our positioning politically, ethics and organizational structure, and the group projects floated and defined. Our weekly meetings were taken up by the day-to-day, week-to-week, and month-to-month details of maintaining production. The early annual general meetings tended to be agreeable, if lengthy affairs, but this was to change in later years. Our position politically could be broadly categorized as non-aligned, though sympathetic to the UDF, as well as the then banned ANC and its many affiliated organizations, as well as the labor movements. First, the Federation of South African Trade Unions, or FOSATU, and later the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU. We were unabashedly aligned to organizations and movements driving resistance and change. In fact, we formed close relationships with these organizations and were kept informed of developments that they required coverage for. We were also the first photographers on call for publications such as the Weekly Mail, Freya Weekblad, New Nation, South, and the Namibian, and the New African, I think, working largely as freelancers. I was also part of the media collective that established the Natal newspaper, the New African. My personal early consciousness and political roots in Black power, then Black consciousness, remained intact and maintained an intertwined, if sometimes uneasy, symbiosis with the supposed non-racism of the democratic movement espoused by the UDF. As a cultural worker, I was hyper aware of the need for a healthy Black awareness to be cultivated as a counter to the deliberate drive by white supremacy and apartheid to undermine and degrade Black people psychologically, and in particular the role of culture in resisting and countering this tendency. Photography education. This was a role we were very conscious of and performed to the best of our ability. One of the main reasons for photography education, apart from imparting skills in the craft itself, was to raise an awareness to the role images played in raising consciousness of social issues and enabling the conscious consumption of such images, as well as an active tool of and for communication. This took the form of photography workshops mainly, that we offered to student organizations, unions, and the likes. Such workshops would cover the basic introduction to photography, the camera as instrument, the use of light, composition, visual storytelling, and importantly, bringing to awareness the pervasive use of images as an informational tool that is used to contain, but could also be used to liberate consciousness. We were conscious of the need to inform and raise the awareness of the use of images and media to those we serviced and worked with. Many of the rapidly forming media organizations had no prior experience or training in media whatsoever. We were also conscious of our individual members' need for training and education in general, because, again, many of us had not benefited from formal and tertiary education and training in media. This, of course, being until as late as when I entered the photography field and beyond. Formal and substantial instruction in photography was preserved for the white demographic in apartheid law. Later, post-1994, I served a brief stint as director of the Market Photo Workshop at the behest of photographer David Goldblatt, who had created the facility. I had been part of a team that had assisted Goldblatt in the informal sessions that had later taken form and been institutionalized into the photo school that would go on to make a huge impact on the Southern African photo scene, introducing hundreds of Black photographers who would otherwise have not had access to photography and broadening representation in what had hitherto been defined by white participation, apart from the likes of Drum, The Daily World, and a few other marginal Black publications. Positioning. Afrapix, from the get-go, located within the SACC as it were, in the offices of the Interchurch Media Projects, the nexus and hub of the organized effort to unseat apartheid, was well positioned to become the go-to photo agency of the struggle. And this we did, albeit in haphazard and uncoordinated fashion, with great success. We became instantly recognizable and welcomed at most political gatherings, and were able to gain greater access to townships and far-flung rural areas in this way, covering the forced relocations that were taking place in the rural areas was a major focus for several of us. And we worked with organizations such as the Transvaal Rural Action Group, PLAS, and Association for Rural Advancement, mostly on a voluntary basis in order to facilitate access to these often remote communities. Afrapix had, as a group, participated in the Botswana Culture and Resistance Conference and actively pursued resolutions that came out of that event, which shaped the organization further. Afrapix also participated in the Culture for Another South Africa, or CASA, conference in Amsterdam, Netherlands, as well as in Zabalaza conference in London, Britain later. Producing exhibitions for all these initiatives, Afrapix was also a participant in the cultural boycott, attending meetings and aligning with those objectives. Similarly, we worked with the trade unions such as COSATU in this way. And though covering endless meetings could sometimes be tedious because we seldom parachuted into and out of meetings and events in the way that the mainstream media workers would do, we spent long hours at meetings in an attempt to get a comprehensive picture of the entire event. Most of this work is yet to be seen and engaged with, locked as it is in the negative archives of the individual photographers who worked in this way. Internationally, Afrapix was modeled loosely on the Paris and New York-based Magnum Photo Agency, who, along with London-based Network Photo Agency, we attempted, without success, to forge relationships with. This was probably because we were an unknown entity in a far-flung African setting. We did manage to establish a working relationship with New York-based Impact Visuals, probably because of their activist stance. Editorial independence. Our decision as a group to remain independent and non-aligned, though partisan, was a conscious one, which we jealously guarded. Individually, we were all largely regarded as progressive and left-leaning, and some may well have had membership of political organizations. Our personal affiliations being left to our individual discretion. This occurred on an individual basis, as well as on a collective one, as in instances when we did joint projects which required group participation in the editorial process, often with outside participants. It is this quality which set the work of Afrapix apart, allowing for the diversity of vision, political outlook, and personal integrity to infuse the work of the collective and agency. I myself never did join and was never a signed-up member of any political organization. While we were largely sympathetic to the UDF as well as surreptitiously to the ANC, we deemed it prudent to remain unaffiliated so as to retain true editorial freedom to produce exactly the work and approach we saw fit. Our engagement with the struggle was nonetheless largely unabashedly partisan. We were committed to change and to the anti-apartheid struggle. Otherwise, our individual political allegiances were progressive, varying from liberal to radical. On hindsight, it is clear that in the heat of the effort to produce images in a rapidly evolving landscape, we perhaps did not pay sufficient attention to the need for more editorial control and analysis of the images being produced, which were left largely to each individual photographer's discretion. We were all the masters of our own individual image-making process, and editorial control was largely absent, manifesting mostly in the editorial decisions taken in the production of exhibitions and books. Arguably, this could also have had its positive outcomes. But looking back on my archive, I can see now how some pointed direction could have improved the caliber and scope of what I chose to photograph at the time. Group membership. Our members came to us largely through word of mouth and through the alternative media. As aspiring photographers entered the field, we were easily identifiable, as our bylines began to appear in the alternative media that was growing, as well as in the mainstream media, as the South African story of resistance to apartheid and for social change began to gain momentum. Getting our bylines included and attached was no easy feat, this being not a regular practice back in the day. And indeed, we felt that a large part of what we did was educating media practitioners in the art of using images and in a respect and value for the producers of these images. Members arrived informally at first and would be deemed contributors, but for those who showed interest, they could be inducted via a process of becoming associates at first, and then full members eventually, which was conducted at our annual general meetings, our AGMs. Because of this process, our membership was always a bit fluid, ebbing and flowing, and to this day, pinning down exactly who were members remains contested. Financial structure and the funding in photography, the uneven racial matrix. As mentioned above, Afrapix was a financially independent body. The organization was self-funded through a levy of 30% of the income of each individual photographer. Whilst these funds were used for staff salaries, rent, office supplies, and such, the expenses of each photographer in the pursuit, execution, and production of their images, remained for their account. This was admittedly not an easy way to remain productive for individual photographers, and also an impediment to recruiting new and fresh members, especially black photographers, who back then mostly emerged from impoverished and deprived backgrounds and could not afford the luxury of not earning from their occupation, expensive as it was to enter in the first place. However, special projects were funded, such as exhibitions and publications, but rarely was there funding for the actual production of photography projects, such as the many field trips and film needed to eventualize any work. For white photographers, this was somewhat different, with many coming from middle-class backgrounds that valued their art and craft and were able to summon the resources to enter and make a mark in the field. I referred to white photographers then as having an uncle in the business, in that largely they emerged from an environment in which they had had libraries, both in their schools and in their homes, had probably had access to art education, both in formal school and in tertiary as well. Many came to photography with a degree or two under their belts already, which put them educationally at a great advantage as they were more equipped and informed to understand the political, social, cultural, and media fields and how best to maximize engagement with it. They were also able to have a larger network through their university affiliations, networks and experience to draw on, and with which to advance their projects and careers. Also, obviously, their more well-endowed families were better equipped to assist them with the necessary and costly equipment, acquisitions, as well as transport solutions. These were difficult conversations that never really took place within Afrapix because of their sensitivities, but are worth reflecting on. Afrapix was viewed somewhat by other black photographers as a white boys' club, and largely that was true. White male photographers predominated, and building on their status in society and advantages that came with it, were largely successful, which cemented their domination within the group. This powerful dynamic had its own ramifications, because obviously both the black male and the white female photographers, black female photographers being far and few back then, resisted this order and militated against it, true to South Africa's divisionary state, at first in their own blocks. It didn't help that to raise these issues within the organization at the time was to have them dismissed as secondary and of little importance. We were, after all, a family, integrated, and a true reflection of a united and diverse South Africa. I recall once pointing out that even I, as a so-called colored, had been subjected to Bantu education, which was ridiculed and laughed off as absurd. These issues, as well as others which I will detail later, were to be at the heart of the dissolution of the group later. The white male dominance manifested in a competitive spirit which was not in accord with our socialist and collective effort, which was what Afrapix had originally emerged from. In fact, as new members entered, consisting predominantly of white males, this competitive spirit began to predominate and cement itself as a culture within the organization, eventually articulating itself as a drive to professionalism. It didn't help that, in fact, the white male members brought in a disproportionate amount of the finances that sustained the organization, growing their sense of power and entitlement. These were teething issues that were a microcosm of what would be encountered on a national level later, as we traversed 1990 and 1994 and our seminal democratic moment, entering into the disparity of a financial apartheid that we find ourselves located in today, complicated as it is by globalism, the digital age, and the neoliberal political economy. Yet another major factor that led to the original disillusionment within Afrapix was the refusal of the ANC's Department of Communications to recognize and engage with our group on their return into the country in 1990. After years of supplying the ANC with images gratis, we had naturally assumed that we would be able to forge a relationship similar to the ones we had with internal organizations, which would again facilitate greater access to people in general and leadership in particular. The ANC itself and affiliated organizations, enhancing our ability to tell the unfolding story of the mass democratic movements, the people's and the ANC's road to power, and the significant changes sweeping the country. To this day, the reason for the ANC's Department of Communications' inability to engage with us remains unclear, as we were unable to secure a single meeting with the organization to discuss this alignment, and all efforts to implore the Department of Communications Director Paulo Jordan or his deputy Jill Marcus were fobbed off. This failure, however, manifested in some of our photographers' discontent within the structure of Afrapix and its ability to function within the rapidly changing political landscape, and a growing realization that they needed to divert from an overtly political and collective approach to one more independent and professional. Organizational change. By the end of the decade of the 1980s, Afrapix was in the throes of internal wrangling and a battle for control of the organization that was largely defined by the emerging professional group and those who maintained a collectivist approach that later manifested in the splitting of the group, with a sector of largely white males breaking off to form a rival group named South. This breakup was particularly traumatic for me and the remaining members, having invested almost a decade of our time and attention to building the organization, and only then to see it shatter apart. An attempt was made to keep Afrapix functioning after the split, but with the major share of the income generators now absent, this just wasn't feasible. And I presided over the closure of Afrapix in 1991. The newly formed South itself broke apart soon after, with the agency being bought and it then changing owners several times and losing its group ownership and control. All the turmoil and trauma of the breakup and change was the closest I had come to what a particularly acrimonious divorce could be like. And there were lessons to be learned in organizational structure and change. I'm not sure how much has been learned from these difficulties because we all simply went on our individual ways and were left to deal with these issues as individuals as best we could. A recent gathering of ex-Afrapixers, ostensibly to work on a joint project with an Israeli left photographers group, around about 2017, 2018 this happened. To work with a joint project with an Israeli left photographers group ended in turmoil as the old issues surfaced and erupted into the gathering, rendering us working as a group difficult, if not impossible. The meeting in Cape Town in mid-2018, that's when it was, with an Israeli-Palestinian group, we realized that the Palestinian members who were not present in the meeting played a marginal role in the organization, which was called Active Stills, still exists. Afrapix was meeting for the first time in 18 years since our disbandment. And there was still a great deal of acrimony, especially from us black photographers, which erupted and sullied our first day of deliberations. We did manage to find accord by the end of the first day, but the Israeli group chose to withdraw, mainly, in my estimation, because of our insistence that the process be adjudicated by the South African Boycott, Disinvestment and Sanctions Committee. Democracy's images. Producing images in the age of democracy has been an exercise of trial and error. Firstly, one had to accustom oneself to engaging entirely alone, and this we all did. Some heading off to work abroad, others joining publications or entering academia, and most like myself, taking on more commercial work as our political landscape went through rapid changes. With a now teenage daughter in a private school, I relied increasingly on work from public relations companies, the only work readily available to myself, to maintain myself and my daughter's needs. This work I found deeply unfulfilling. Having never had any such ambition or ability actually to produce such work, as a result of which I became increasingly frustrated with the direction democracy had taken my personal work and output, eventually bringing it to a halt. The first such change was that of the Reconstruction and Development Program, the RDP, itself short-lived, which had a tendency not to use the work of established South African photographers who had functioned throughout the struggle for change, employing savvy young international photographers adept at cutting-edge editorial techniques and styles. We quickly began to realize that we had been stuck in an ossified age. Then the RDP was abruptly shut down, and shortly after the rug was pulled from funding from the many NGOs we had relied on as clients, the funding being diverted to government itself. Our sources of publishing outlets and income rapidly diminished and disappeared. Government's media arm, the Government Communications and Information System, or GCIS, hired permanent photography staff, and although they also relied on freelancers to supplement their staff component, insisted on ownership of all images produced by freelancers on these assignments, something which the few of us who were at the forefront of fighting to regain copyright of our images from a retrogressive and exploitative apartheid era Intellectual Property Act were not prepared to accept, had in fact militated against, and were aghast that our new democracy was ever so eager to exploit these regressive laws for its own benefit itself. Governmental departments themselves were also quick to divert their budgets to employing professional public relations companies, as well as advertising agencies to produce the slick images that made them look good on the surface. Our realism images were to them outmoded, outdated, and for all intents and purposes, obsolete. I would hasten to add, though, that the authenticity of the realism and integrity that our images brought to bear was exactly what was needed to legitimately both inform and enjoin South Africans to the task of nation building at hand. The contrived images of an editorial and public relations bent rang hollow and failed to convince its intended public as to the veracity of the task at hand. Globalization and the digital age. Other factors, some of a seismic nature, were also impacting on the ability of independent photographers in particular, and even those in media houses to perform their functions. The biggest of these was the rapidly globalizing and accompanying neoliberal world order that South Africa emerged into in the decade of the 1990s. Globalization was accompanied by the digitization of photography, something most photographers approached with dread at first. Automation and computerization had enveloped photography. Digital photography, itself a wonder and a quantum leap in camera technology, also allowed for many more aspiring photographers to enter the field, the functions of the camera now being automated. The internet also encouraged a plethora of images to be shared globally, with many archives literally available for free. The digital glut of cheap and indeed free images changed the economic ecology within which photographers, along with media publications in general, functioned. With established media business models rapidly changing, so did that of independent photographers, especially that of the genre of documentary photography. The financial model within this rapidly emerging digital world has not been able to support photographers easily, and therefore finding and accessing resources to produce images, especially those that depend on working in the field rather than a studio, has become increasingly difficult and well nigh impossible. The irony of a world of digital image glut, produced by several billion cell phone cameras daily, has negated the role of the specialized documentary photographer. Today, everybody has the potential to document their world, and do, even if the ability to curate these images and produce a lasting legacy has not quite been worked out yet. We rely on an ever-changing blur of images that fleetingly flit across our screens, most never to be seen again, and others equally liable to disappear with lost or stolen devices, or crash devices, or crash digital storage devices, as well as the ability of social media platforms to simply disappear media deemed offensive or politically inexpedient. However, along with this precarious state of image making, has evolved an appreciation of images as repositories of knowledge by academia and scholars of society and history in particular. Images have that particular ability to retain information of place and time and allow for rich studies into the and people gone by, times and people gone by. In fact, images are still valid and crucial to the study of present time, which rapidly flits by in an ever-evolving world which seems to pass at an ever-increasing rate or pace. Our human consciousness still seems to require that we slow things down or halt them completely from time to time, all the better to make sense of our rapidly changing world. Whilst the internet performs a crucial role in preserving huge volumes of images available at the click of a mouse or keyboard key, the need for curated images that mark significant moments in time remain in demand. Perhaps this conjunction will evolve naturally as we come to terms with this new digital architecture and command our ability to incorporate it into our world and practice. The photographic archive. The idea of the archive is rapidly becoming one associated with archaic images from a distant past, one associated with an analog age. This analog archive is presenting itself as a challenge of huge proportions to deal adequately with, given that the market on which it depended to self-perpetuate has largely disappeared. The preservation and accessibility of these images now falls largely on the originators and authors of the images, most of whom are not up to the task, as well as few academic institutions and archives, most of which are massively underfunded and also unable to cope with the task at hand. The academy has also succumbed to a temptation to empire build, with archives snapped up for a song, and in some instances, authors deprived of their intellectual property rights, with few local and national academic institutions up to the task of establishing and maintaining the archive. Some South African photographers, and arguably increasingly more, now look to international destinations to ensure the viability of a sustained life for their archives. The knowledge and key details of formal apartheid and colonial past of our country is rapidly fading down a memory hole in every respect, other than that of the manifestations of both manufactured conditions which continue to plague our present. Understanding that past is crucial to the methods and strategies we need to manufacture to bring lasting and meaningful change that makes that past a truly distant reality. Images have a role to play in this process, and them being preserved and accessible in print, in publication, and on the internet is crucial to that function. Exhibitions and the art world. Art has always had a complicated relationship with photography, seeing it initially as an interloper and threat over a century ago, as photography usurped painters' roles in depicting the world to an extent. This relationship evolved in a complex dance until, in the 1980s and the 1990s, contemporary artists themselves finally embraced still and moving images and incorporated them into their practice. Now it was the turn of photographers to view this development guardedly and with suspicion. Some of us, however, myself included, welcomed this development, regarding it as a natural progression and one which would enhance both our practices. Except for an exclusive few, not many photographers have managed to gain traction within the art world, with that of private collections in particular not being enamored by the realism of documentary photography, rather choosing to embrace work that is more closely aligned to issues such as that of identity politics. The corporations and oligarchs who maintain art collections are loath to bring into their collections work that is overtly critical of the capitalist economic system and its obvious failures to bring a decent quality of life to the majority of its citizens. This has meant that most documentary photographers are unable to gain financial independence and are heavily reliant on grants and funding to produce work. Those photographers who are adept at producing the work acceptable to the wealthy elite and are able to access this world of funding are the ones who remain able to continue to produce. And it is their work on which the dominant narrative is continued and maintained, with that of those unable to access financial resources becoming dormant and silenced. Documentary photographers remain dependent on exhibitions as a platform through which best to show their work, which straddles the art world through galleries and museums that are intertwined within the art world. So paradoxically, as the sophistication of image consumption is in fact enhanced, the field of practitioners is reduced to those able to build a client base of art collectors, as well as those able to navigate successfully the world of funding. Curators and galleries, especially those that have a commercial client base, are key to gaining access to this lucrative world. The marketplace. The marketplace, that much vaunted space where we are meant to find succor and sustenance, is more of a mirage than a reality. In publishing, there are simply not enough publications that require the commissioning of work or the rights to publish to sustain photographers. Publications, many working in an ever-increasing dire straits themselves, simply don't have the resources they once had. In the art world, the jury is still out on whether documentary photography qualifies as art. And so, apart from a handful of practitioners who make it into the exclusive select few, the rest are left out in the cold. The contemporary postmodern art world is not moved by reality, requiring it to be greatly modified before consumption. So apart from a handful of public art institutions who do see the validity and necessity of documentary photography, not much of the private sector does, which excludes one from the largest of the many private collections owned by finance, media companies, insurance sector, energy sector, communications, and the privately owned collections. The public collections, held by municipalities and their museums and galleries, as well as universities, are generally more adept and able at broadening their collections beyond the usual suspects and the dictates of the art marketplace, and work hard at attempting to include work that is representative of the wider cultural workers countrywide. Though, of course, the caveat being that public collections are mostly hamstrung by that old canard, with a few notable exceptions of a lack of budgets and resources themselves. There are a few newly emerged black collectors who have entered the field, and I have had the good fortune to be supported by some of these people. But my experience is that most see acquisitions as investments and are only interested in performing stock, so to speak. The vision of building acquisitions that will reflect the breadth and diversity of work is largely absent, with collectors sticking to the well-beaten art market track. A vision that encapsulates nation building, a resurrection of a Southern African vision within documentary photography in particular, is yet to emerge, being strangled at birth by a distinct lack of financial resources, both to produce the necessary work as well as to archive it in ways that ensure its perpetuation through publication and dissemination. Looking ahead with eyes of the past, my personal exhibition trajectory. I had participated in a few group exhibitions in the past, these being during Apartheid, which were financed from abroad within the ambit of anti-apartheid funding, usually low-budget productions. Some of these exhibitions include Beyond the Barricades, The Cordoned Heart, and Uprooting Poverty. Exhibiting, which has always not been the easiest of tasks, proved to become far more difficult after 1994. Having said this, my first break for being able to exhibit solo came in 1996, when I was invited by Kwamuhle Museum, which is part of the now eThekwini Municipality Museums, doing so with the production resources coming from the museum. This exhibition, named The Hidden Years, which examined a decade of work produced in KwaZulu-Natal from 1983 through to 1992, revealed aspects of the province which had evaded public scrutiny. However, efforts to publish this work continued to be in vain, and I found it increasingly difficult to access resources to do so even in later years. Almost a decade later, in 2005, I produced an exhibition which I had begun almost 2 decades earlier in the 1980s and worked on fitfully since, called Blood Relatives, which investigated the shifting nature of hybridized identity and its relationship to wider South African identities, using my large family as a template. This work coincided with the global trend to reinvestigate identity given the dictates of globalization as it reshaped identities worldwide, national borders and identities. I also got the opportunity to direct a television documentary, also called Blood Relatives, on the same theme and based on the photographic work, which was commissioned and widely screened by the South African Broadcasting Corporation, and essentially thanks to my good friend Eddie Koch. Then came a mid-career retrospective exhibition in 2012 named Call and Response, thanks to the German South Africa-based gallery I was with at the time, Zypel Gallery, which I was able to both produce a catalogue or book on the work published by German publisher Hachi Kanz, and tour the exhibition extensively both in South Africa and abroad. The book was also had a South African imprint published by Fourth Wall Books. In 2015, I produced an exhibition and an accompanying book called Unsettled, 100 Years War of Resistance by Xhosa against Boer and British, which also toured extensively both in South Africa and abroad. This book was published by New York-based Archipelago Books. In 2015, I also produced and directed a video documentary on the once famous Rookstrift Arts and Crafts Centre, and now defunct art school, which attempted to tell the story of the difficulties experienced in developing the arts sector within a Southern African context. Blood Relatives, Call and Response, and Unsettled all received mainstream media reviews, some included in the major Sunday newspapers and including radio and television interviews. Call and Response was exhibited 15 times nationally and internationally. Unsettled was exhibited 14 times nationally and abroad, including a talks program both locally and abroad. The film Blood Relatives was included in the Durban Film Festival, and Rookstrift premiered in the Paxa Pietermaritzburg Arts Festival. Blood Relatives was also shown by South African Broadcasting Corporation many times in South Africa and in fact across the continent. I'm currently working on the continuation of the Unsettled series, a trilogy which will include the story of the resistance of indigenous Khoi, Ku, and Bushmen, and the genocide and dispossession of these groups, and their re-emergence in a post-apartheid South Africa, as well also the story of slavery, which encompasses almost half our settled and colonized history in South Africa. And without factoring it into our calculus, we can never comprehend contemporary South Africa. The marks and markers of our painful past are everywhere to be seen once we know how and where to look. I am also, in partnership with an independent scholar, embarking on a project which examines the role and place in Southern African society of the black woman through my documentation of my maternal grandmother, who I photographed from around 1982 through to her death at 103 years of age in 2003. She was born in 1900. This work of a peasant woman of hybridized descent, located within Zulu society, will examine her life from the perspective of resistance and refusal during several epochs of change within Southern Africa. Government's funding institutions are oblique and onerous to deal with, and not geared to supporting individual photographers, focusing mainly, it would seem, on organizations. And even so, funding is notoriously fickle, far too little, and completely unsustainable. The neoliberal order seems to require that these cultural efforts be left to the tender mercies of the marketplace, where most go to die. Rebuilding a true South African culture is an impossible task under the current circumstances. Song and dance and the television dramas are great entertainment, but far more is required to truly address the current paucity of the South African soul and build a sovereign South African identity. I'd say a Southern African identity. The task ahead. Documentary photography is still confronted with the gargantuan task of providing curated imagery, which is necessary to assist in making sense of the crisis in nation building we remain faced with. South Africa is a diverse and expansive land, and we remain mired in social conditions which range from a status quo to rapidly evolving social relations which need study. Given the acceptance and readiness of academia in particular to embrace the image as a reliable source of knowledge production, the task is ever more urgent for such widespread projects to be undertaken and executed. One such task is the archive, which, as mentioned above, has been engaged with sporadically and in a piecemeal fashion. Along with KwaZulu-Natal-based colleagues, Rafik Mayet, Jiva Rajgopal, and Desini Mudlia, we have initiated a project to contribute to the creation of an archive for photographic work, which is importantly molded and controlled by photographers themselves, which we have named the African Documentary Photographers Archive Initiative, or ADPI. This boldly named non-profit initiative speaks to the need for the archiving of photographic bodies of work throughout the continent. This archive, which will be located within the Durban University of Technology and its project Arts for Humanity, will retain its independence while intending to collate these important works, digitize them, safely store the negatives, which are now vulnerable and precious artifacts, make those works accessible to researchers and curators, produce media such as exhibitions and publications as well as fine prints, all the while retaining ownership of the work with relevant creators of their inheritors for the duration of their intellectual property rights. With all the lip service paid to the primacy of the archive, finding support and resources for this critical initiative has thus far proved futile. Actually, a caveat is that we have had an initial funding to take the project forward. Work produced in this vein simply cannot be relegated to the sphere of exhibition, but needs to be published as well, both digitally and in print, allowing for widespread access, study, curation, engagement, and archiving. Most importantly, the production of such work cannot simply be left to the vagaries of the marketplace, which demonstrably places little value on work of this nature, but needs considered attention and focus, or this genre will surely fade away along with the prospects of a nation state that is itself devoid of vision and a world to resurrect itself anew as a manifestation of the people it is meant to serve, in order to truly liberate them from the shackles of neocolonialism, impoverishment, and not just of the powerful corporations, their shareholders and wealthy elite who currently shape the actions of what should be the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And the essay ends here, and I thank you for your attention.